Joining me now is Thomas Frank. Tom Frank is perhaps best known for his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, and his latest book, Listen Liberal, or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. We talked with Tom about that book when it came out, but there have been a lot of developments since then. So, first of all, Thomas Frank, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Secondly, I should tell you, there's been so much going on with the Democratic Party now, and it's been so interesting to watch it play out that I did want to get your perspective on it, because it seems as if every day we see another story of power shift or debate within the Democratic Party. I certainly see every hour, every minute on social media, kind of combat going on between the forces of what might be called centrism or the Clinton-Obama wing of the party, and loosely might be called the Sanders or left wing of the party. And you've been saying for a long time, especially in your latest book, Listen Liberal, that the party has become a party of the elite. Do you feel that is being borne out or challenged, or both, by the events that have taken place since the Trump election?
Well, the first thing to mention is the Trump election. That's what all of these judgments are about, and that was the centrist faction of the Democratic Party that succeeded in losing that election, losing it to the most unpopular and unqualified presidential candidate of all time. And I also want to remind you of one other thing, that the centrist faction of the Democratic Party, this is who I describe in Listen Liberal, and how this group came to dominate the Democratic Party, that these people sold themselves to Democrats over the years as the winning faction, the faction that would deliver victory. They would sell you out on all these principles. They'd sell you out in all sorts of ways. But they would forget about the New Deal and forget about what Democrats had traditionally stood for. All that was gone. They were new Democrats, but they would win elections.
Right.
And
just to jump in for a second, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think they always said, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That was Bill Clinton's favorite line, meaning don't let your purism prevent you from winning. So, okay.
I know. How about letting the bad be the enemy of the good?
Right.
I mean, with Bill Clinton, this is a guy. You remember you read Listen Liberal when it first came out.
Right.
I mean, now it's out in paperback, right? So now it's all affordable and everything. But a big part of Listen Liberal is concerned with the legacy of the Bill Clinton years.
Right.
And this guy, he basically accomplished the Reagan agenda. He got things done that the Republicans never dreamed of getting done. NAFTA was a Republican trade agreement that they couldn't pass through Congress. Welfare reform was a big Republican proposal. Bank deregulation. Republicans had wanted this forever, but Reagan couldn't get it done. Clinton got it done. In all three of these cases, and many more, like the balanced budget, telecom deregulation, he accomplished the conservative agenda. The mass incarceration bill in 2004 accomplished the conservative agenda in ways that the Republicans themselves could never have achieved. Now, whether I don't know if that's making the good the enemy of, what did you say? The perfect.
Right. That was
good.
Bill's.
It's just a sophistry. It means nothing.
Right.
If you look at what the guy actually did, it's lamentable. It's disastrous.
No, that was his favorite line. Whenever somebody would say, "Gee, we really ought to fight for helping people,"
we ought to not deregulate Wall Street.
Right. He would say, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." To which my answer was always, and vice versa too. Don't always aim lower, because you'll keep going lower. And as long as we're talking about accomplishing the Republican agenda, Thomas Frank, that leads to, in a sense, to the Affordable Care Act. And the fact that some of the core provisions of the Affordable Care Act were the Republican, originally proposed as Republican alternatives to, let's say, Medicare for All, or even Hillary Clinton's original proposal. And now, I want your thoughts on this, Tom, very much.
Yes, well, that's entirely fair. The Affordable Care Act began as a heritage foundation, a counterproposal to health care in the early '90s, and then we saw it in Massachusetts as Romney Care, and then it of course gets passed into law by a Democratic Congress with a Democratic president, with almost every Republican in Congress opposing it, of course. And but you can see what I'm describing here when you look at the continuity from Bill Clinton to something like that, and that is that the Democrats really have become the Republicans of old, sort of like well, I don't want to say Eisenhower Republicans because that's too liberal for them. But you look at Obama's other the big moments of President Obama's term in office, and they were all. I mean, one way of looking at them is to say they were half measures, or that he didn't go far enough. But another way of looking at them is just to say, well, he ruled like a Republican would, only like with Wall Street, where he didn't punish anybody, didn't roll back the bailouts, didn't do any of the things that a traditional Democrat would have done. But he also didn't do things that a traditional Republican would have done. A Republican, his predecessor, George W. Bush, actually prosecuted the guys at Enron.
Right. I was just going to say
Obama didn't do that. George Bush's dad prosecuted thousands of bankers during the S&L fiasco. Obama didn't do that. He wasn't even as tough as a Republican, let alone a Franklin Roosevelt sort of figure.
And then you have Tom Frank. Then you have what I think is an interesting kind of like final era, final act plot twist, like when the hand comes out of the grave in the final scene. When it comes to the Affordable Care Act, which is when the Republicans decide to quote unquote repeal and replace, what they really came up with it didn't pass, but the so-called Trump Care bill that they're about to take another attempt at was really different from the Affordable Care Act in certain ways, as certainly worse, but it contained some of the same political philosophy, tax breaks for this and a certain amount of benefit tweaking. So it almost seemed to me a difference in degree, but not a fundamental philosophical difference. After all of that,
I know. Well, and Trump and the Republicans have been railing against it since the day it was passed, and then he gets into office and he's like, "Hey, this isn't so bad." Once it's all explained to him, but that's so typical of Trump that he didn't really understand. So many of the things he was campaigning on. He had no idea what he was even talking about. Yeah, very typical. It's also really depressing. But the guy, one more little twist for you, he succeeded in defeating Hillary Clinton in many ways by using old school Democratic language, faking the Franklin Roosevelt language, pretending to care about what he called the forgotten, the forgotten man and the forgotten woman. Pretending to be on the side of hard-bitten workers in the deindustrialized zones. He pretended to be an old-school Democrat, and people found that more attractive in a lot of ways than what Hillary was offering.
Which included going to West Virginia and saying those coal jobs aren't coming back.
Yeah, they're not coming back. Yeah,
sorry.
And by the way, when she did that, also condemning the sort of intelligentsia of the Democratic Party to have to try to come up with an explanation for that for the next 4 years, and turn that into the party's reason for existence, because we understand things like that coal is going away, and we know all about automation and this sort of thing, and everybody else doesn't. It's just so ugly what has happened.
Yeah, and I want to talk about, there are two areas I want to make sure we have time to get into. Thomas Frank, author of Listen Liberal, which is now out in paperback. One of them, because I don't have a therapist anymore, okay, so I have to talk to you about these things. One is, and you just touched on it, the sense of not only superiority, but almost dismissive superiority, typified by a lot of people who lined up behind Hillary Clinton, who basically not only said, I disagree with you on this policy, let's say, whether it's Medicare for all or anything else, but I disagree with you with a level of contempt that is essentially tribal. That is, I disagree with Paul Krugman, for example, wrote a piece about Gerald Friedman, an economist at the University of Massachusetts, who wrote an analysis of Bernie Sanders' economic agenda that said it would cause substantial growth. Now, that's classic Keynesian interpretation of what Bernie would do.
I remember this dispute,
Yeah, Jerry Friedman, who says he supported Hillary Clinton and said it at the time, Krugman and others responded with this. Krugman was saying, let's say you're an economist at a nowhere university, and I'm paraphrasing, but not by much, and nobody knows you and nobody cares about you, then in order to desperately get into the inner circle, you'll say or do anything. I mean, didn't it attack him in the most ad hominem way, the most vicious way?
But wait, that's not for Krugman. That's actually I shouldn't say for Krugman. For a lot of professional economists, that is how you attack someone. This is. Do you remember the thesis of Listen Liberals that the Democrats, the inner circle of the Democratic Party, the people who run the Democratic Party are advanced members of the professional class. These are highly educated, white-collar professionals, and they have internalized the logic, the sort of the way of thinking, the way of understanding the world of the professional class, and that's what you see in the Democratic Party. You know, you got Hillary Clinton running as a resume candidate, supposed to be the most qualified candidate of all time. That's her selling point. You know, people don't care about that, but that's how they tried to sell her. And here's Krugman basically drawing the perimeters of professional acceptability in his newspaper column. This is what professions do. So I spent a lot of my life in academia. You probably don't know this, but I got a PhD in history, and at the University of Chicago, I used to spend a lot of time around these kind of people. And this is how professions work, especially academic professions, is with defining who's in and defining who's out. And the only thing that's interesting about it is that Krugman is doing it in a newspaper column, supposedly written for the general public. Like, why the general public would give a damn about any of that? I don't know, but because academics do this sort of thing in private and in academic journals all the time.
Well, what's interesting about that, Tom, that's a great observation, but what's especially interesting about it in the field of economics, which claims to be a science, is that being right, right is not what gets you expelled or prevents your advancement. It's how close you are to the center.
Yes. It's are you inside the parameters of the acceptable or are you not? Are you part of the in-group or are you not? There's one of the essays that I relied upon when I was writing Listen Liberal is by James K. Galbraith, who's the son of John Kenneth Galbraith. And it's an analysis of how professional economics works and how this discipline manages to define who is, an acceptable expert and who is not, even when the acceptable experts, according to their definition, are constantly wrong, and predict things that never happen and don't see coming all sorts of things that do happen and are, wrong about the real world in all sorts of ways, and yet they manage to control, the sort of whatever you'd call it, all the legitimacy that goes with being a professional economist.
And they define
this is a pretty big deal of legitimacy. This is a very big deal, and so he's wondering how they do this, and it's exactly what you just described. It's defining defining the limits of the acceptable, defining certain people out.
And language determines the limits of the acceptable. I was working for Bernie Sanders during the primary, and everybody was outraged when he would talk about policy A or policy B, and he would say, well, I just think you got to break up the big banks. And they would say, oh, yeah, it's not that simple, Bernie, in this condescending voice. But
but that's the same thing.
Contend
it's in groups. It's in groups.
Right.
It's in groups defining who's out.
And I contend
what Bernie Sanders was advocating was not radical.
And I contend that language plays a part in that. That if Bernie had said, well, I believe there has to be a certain firewall between certain banking functions that is best established through this, that is kind of linguistic code switching,
Yeah, that may have worked, but a big part of the problem is Bernie himself, that he is not part of the cool kids club.
Right.
And he's always been outside, and he still is. And by the way, I say this as an admirer of Bernie Sanders, and you know, as someone that actually voted for him in the Democratic primaries, and the way they treat him, the contempt with which these people treat him is remarkable. And by the way, it goes on to this day. There was a story, I'm forgetting where I saw it, but it was during the campaign where it was written by some Democratic insider explaining why Bernie Sanders was unacceptable. And they said, you know, his ideas are not radical, his ideas aren't strange, his ideas are even good ones. But we in the, you know, the in-group, the Democratic in-group, don't talk that way. It's sort of what you're saying.
Yeah.
He uses the wrong terms to describe these things, and he's not. But most importantly, it's just simply that he is not part of our set. He and his supporters, he and his followers, he and his advisors are not part of our group. And that's, I mean, it seems trivial and stupid, but I'm here to tell you, if you are listening outside of Washington, D.C., that is how Washington works.
And that is also how Democrats lose. And
yeah, no kidding, because they can never see this.
Right.
They're so deep inside of it because it's they themselves. This is how they think. And they can't see that you know, that this, how repugnant this is to the rest of the country.
Well, and in the time-honored phrase, and we're going to have to end it with this, but in the time-honored phrase, we'll apply it to the Democrats, how's that working out for you? Right? So, unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but it's been great talking to you, especially since I do not have a therapist anymore. Thomas Frank, author of Listen Liberal or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People, now out in paperback. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Anytime.